Welcome, everybody. So this is an event that is sponsored by Braver Angels as well as the League of Women Voters of Austin area. I happen to be Braver Angels politics group chair. And this, I think, falls under politics, and I'm absolutely passionate about having people be educated before they go vote. And we have an election coming up May 6th, and therefore I felt obligated to do that. And the Lakewood Homeowners Association is very good about lending this facility when it is open to the public, especially when it's an educational event that's around voting. So you might be invited to another one, closer to various different elections. So the way we will do this tonight is we have a moderator, Carl, and he is with Braver Angels. And we have 3 panelists who will talk to us about this event. We are taping this event, and we will put it up on the web. So if you know folks who would like to see the conversation, but were not able to make it tonight, we will let you know when it's up and available. When you ask questions are supposed to end with a question mark. So we'll ask you to be polite when you ask your question. Make sure it is a question rather than a statement or, so again, it's an educational event to be sure that you understand what you're voting for when you go vote. So without further ado, I will pass the baton to Carl.
I have my own mic. I don't know why, but so thank you all for coming. And I just wanted to reinforce first what Joanne mentioned, that it's a joint event with the Austin Area League of Women Voters and Braver Angels of Central Texas. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Central Texas Alliance for Braver Angels. And our mission is to promote civic conversation and dialogue and cooperation, and to help depolarize the politics that we have, and even beyond politics, how we speak about other kinds of issues. I don't want to leave you out of. And so at Braver Angels, we promote civic dialogue, and we promote trying to understand how someone you may disagree with has come to the views that they have. Because we find that once you live in that space a little bit, you may not agree. We're not about trying to change anybody's mind about issues, but we are about trying to change the way people view folks that are on the other side of a particular issue. So we have a bunch of workshops. We have a debate kind of events. This one's a little bit different, but as Joanne said, it's not really an opportunity to try to convince someone else of which way to vote on this particular issue, but really to understand, and maybe to understand how someone might vote on one of the propositions, or how they might come to view it and vote on the other. So I'm going to first introduce our panel, and then I'll come back, because this is a fantastic panel that Joanne was able to assemble. At the end is Jessica Foreman, and Jessica is president-elect, or very soon to be president.
3 more weeks. I've got 3 more weeks, Carl.
All right. So president-elect of the League of Women Voters, the Austin Area League. She's also the education manager at the Texas Justice Court Training Center, which is located at Texas State University. And that center is an educational activity of the Justices of the Peace and Constables Association, and it's funded by a grant from the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. It's fascinating to me that Justices of the Peace and Constables Association is the largest organization of elected county officials in the state of Texas. So I have all sorts of visions, Joanne, of for you of braver politics, of working with them. And the Justice of the Peace Association is involved in providing judicial education, and it's been working on that since 1958. Amy Stansbury, in the middle, is a local journalist, and she's the editor-in-chief of the Austin Common, a local community news source and civic education organization that helps Austinites, all of us, be informed and hopefully make a difference in our city. She's also the co-founder of A Functional Democracy, an organization with the same mission. She started out in journalism as the City Hall reporter for the Evening Sun in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And she got her BA in journalism from Temple University. And as I was mentioning a bit earlier, if you go on and look at Amy's LinkedIn page or you'll get tired very quickly about how much energy she has. And so I'm glad that she's here. And finally, Carsten Andresen, okay, is associate professor of criminal justice at St. Edward's. And he's taught there for about the last 7 years. Before that, he was at Travis County Justice Planning as a planning manager. And he also worked, and I think we're going to all learn some things about this, as a key researcher for the Center for Criminal Justice Policy Research with the Boston Police Department. At Northeastern, the university up in Boston. And he was the primary researcher on 4 projects for the Boston Police Department. He received his PhD in criminal justice from Rutgers. So you can see we've got a panel of experts that I think we can all learn a lot from. Jessica, if you would start us out, and she's going to include some opening comments about what the Office of Police Oversight does and when and why it came to be. And so with that, she'll kind of set the stage for what we're going for.
Okay. Well, first off, thank you to Braver Angels for allowing the League of Women Voters of Austin area to partner on this event. And thank you all for coming. I think what we're going to talk about today really mirrors the national conversation we're having on policing and community. And so this is a really specific breakdown of that as you get ready to vote here in May. So oftentimes when we talk about propositions or politics or things like that, we really naturally kind of frame it in our brain because of TV and politics and everything as, is this liberal or conservative? Is this Democrat or Republican? But I'd like you to not do that for this one, and instead to think of a few different frameworks when we're talking about the Office of Police Oversight. And for those frameworks, I'd like you to think of, what does the law say that it can do? So the law. What are the politics surrounding the office? So politics. And a third one, what about contracts? I know that one's a little tricky, but so what I mean by that is when the Office of Police Oversight was created and as it runs, what does it have the authority under the state law in Texas to be able to do and regulate? And secondly, what are the politics surrounding it? We know that every single thing that happens in our city involves politics. And when I say politics, sometimes that's kind of thought of as a dirty word, but what I mean is interest groups and who's involved, and the police association, people who are reimagining policing, regular citizens. The city council plays a role in this. They're elected officials. Obviously, it's going to be guided somewhat by politics. And third, that word contracts is going to be very important with the Office of Police Oversight because it's going to tack very closely to union contracts with the police department. So the city goes into contract negotiations with APD, and the Office of Police Oversight is a part of those contract negotiations. And you'll see when we go over the history that that's played out in a lot of different ways, and it's going to tie into what the propositions actually do. So to give you some background, the Office of Police Oversight was created in 2018, but it had a predecessor called the Office of Police Monitor, which has been around, or which was around since 2001. And it was housed within the Austin Police Department, while the Office of Police Oversight is a complete separate entity. In the mid-2010s, there was an audit put out by the city auditor, and this was also happening right around the time that interest groups and different advocacy groups were considering different things about policing, reimagining policing in our cities. And one part of that was reimagining how police departments handled citizen and internal complaints. And so this audit was looking specifically into how APD handled internal complaints. And they were getting feedback from the Office of Police Monitor, from APD, and from the public. And their audit had some specific findings, had a lot of findings, but I think the most important ones to talk about was that the complaint process was quite difficult and people didn't know how to use it. The database that was supposed to capture all of the complaints and incidents was incomplete. It was missing even some high-profile case data. Obviously, that's not a good database if it doesn't have all the information in there. And there was a very inconsistent handling of complaints, if they came from a citizen versus internal, and they were just, the system wasn't very clear. And it seemed like all the stakeholders agreed. APD agreed that the system wasn't working very well as the Office of Police Monitor, as well as the community groups. But how to overcome that, there were many different opinions on that. So it was recommended to create a new office, the Office of Police Oversight. This was in 2018. And at the same time this was happening, that was a contract negotiation year for APD and the city. And how oversight was going to function was a very big catching point in the contract negotiations. Now, contract negotiations, if you've ever gone into your boss and asked for a raise, you kind of know, you start from a point where I want this, you don't want this. And you end up, I'll give a little here, you'll give a little here. So they did end up agreeing to the Office of Police Oversight. But I think it's important to note that there were some tensions that stayed right below the surface in 2018 that were never really resolved and that we have seen popped up throughout this election. So the Office of Police Oversight had some specific things that made it quite different from the Office of Police Monitor. It accepted anonymous complaints. They consider that very important because sometimes internal complaints, i.e. complaints from the police about other police or the way it's functioning, you can imagine that they might want to do that anonymously. There was a publication of complaints to the public, only the ones that resulted in disciplinary action. And also, if the police chief disagreed with the findings, he or she was required to make a public statement. So those were kind of the sticking points in that. So the Office of Police Oversight they started doing their job, they started doing that. And then in 2021, so when you have a labor contract between APD and the city, there's a third-party arbitrator that if one of you has a problem and says, the other group's not following the contract, then you go to this third party and they rule on who's right and who's wrong. So APD said the Office of Police Oversight is stepping over its role. They are gathering evidence and interviewing witnesses, which is explicitly forbidden in the contract. And the arbitrator said, you know what? You're right. This doesn't mean they were doing anything against the law. It's not against the law to do that. It's against the labor contract that they had with the city. And this will also be important when we talk about what's in the propositions. So APD was watching very closely and felt like the office was overstepping their bounds. The office felt like they were doing their job, but they were being hampered. So again, those tensions kind of rising to the surface. So that's kind of the background that's going to get us here. But I want here, as in a few weeks when you have to vote. But I want to give you a tiny little background on what the office actually does. It has three major divisions. The one everyone's really focused on is the complaint division. There's also a division of communications and community engagement. Everyone's fine with that division. So there's also a policy and research. That's the one that puts out their reports and gathers their data. But most of the real hitting points are on the complaint process. So what is the complaint process? How do you do it? The Office of Police Oversight receives the complaint. It reviews it. If it needs to be sent on to the APD, it does. APD then reviews it while this is monitored by the Office of Police Oversight. And then the director of the police oversight, of the Office of Police Oversight, and APD review the findings, and the Office of Police Oversight notifies the person who submitted the complaint. And I have some numbers here. These are 2021 numbers. There were 2,239 contacts received by the Office of Police Oversight. Of those 2,239, 220 met the standard to be a complaint. Let me explain what that meant. A lot of folks will go and submit a contact, and really they're more complaining about law enforcement in general. Maybe they think police shouldn't have the power to do this, but the Office of Police Oversight can't handle those kinds of complaints. It has to be a specific complaint. This officer did this. So a lot of the general information might be like, I don't like the law enforcement in driving down my road at night, which can't result in a real complaint. So the 220 complaints sent to APD for investigations, 90 were investigated through the process I just described, and 130 were investigated through another process. I tried really hard to figure out why that is, and I believe it's because those 130 complaints fell more under HR issues. Like they might have been internal complaints, like my boss should have given me a raise and they didn't. So there's a different procedure for how those are monitored. And then of the 90 complaints that were investigated, 16 had sustained policy violations. And of the 130 internal complaints, 60 resulted in sustained violations. The most common violations fell under the category of vehicles. That might be you saw a law enforcement officer doing some speeding or running a red light or something like that. General conduct, that's mostly kind of internal HR things. Maybe you said something inappropriate to your coworker. Responsibility to the community, that's like bias in how you were policing, or incident reporting and documentation. Law enforcement, when they make an arrest, when they do almost anything, they are required by law to do a very specific kind of reporting. And if you don't do that, you can get a violation. So that's to give you some background on how it worked, how the complaint process has worked in the last few years, and kind of where we're at now.
What a great setup for next. But before we go there, two things. One, excuse me. Would you repeat exactly how, once a complaint is made, how the investigation works again today under the current
Yes,
system?
absolutely. So the Office of Police Oversight receives it, and then they review it. And that review is like we were talking about, how lots of folks submit information that doesn't actually make it to a complaint. So they review it and say, yes, this actually qualifies as a formal complaint. And then they send it to the Austin Police Department, who reviews it and essentially starts an investigation. And the Office of Police Oversight monitors APD's investigation. That's a really important clue, because do you remember how I said that APD said the OPO, so many acronyms, was gathering evidence and interviewing witnesses, which is not allowed by the current contract. So the Office of Police Oversight can only overview APD's process, not actually work on the process or do it themselves. And then APD and the director of the Office of Police Oversight review the findings together. And depending on the findings, there can be lots of different things that happen. But the Office of Police Oversight then notifies the person that put in the complaint initially. Sometimes it can be publicized, but not all the complaints rise to the level where they need to publicize it. So.
And who sits on the Office of Police Oversight?
I believe it says that it's the director that reviews with APD.
Okay,
So Devin Desai is the current interim director, I believe, so.
okay. And getting to the type of violations that were most common, I was telling my 11-year-old grandson about, coming to do this, and he said, yeah, I saw these 4 police cars, and they put on their lights so they could go through a red light, and then they turned their lights off after they'd gone through the red light. So that might be one of the driving ones that gets a...
I could see that might be a lot that's filed, so.
All right. Okay, thanks so much. So Amy is going to talk about what's in Proposition A and Proposition B and what they would actually do, what's led up to the election, and who put both of these propositions together. Over to you, Amy.
Okay, so I'm going to share a little bit, the history and some of the more politics behind some of what's going on here. For my job, I interview a lot of these folks who are the players in this, so I'm kind of try and relay some of what they've shared with me as well, to kind of get the perspectives of the different sides. So basically, after that arbitration decision that removed, that found that the Office of Police Oversight had overstepped the things in the contract, a lot of criminal justice reform advocates who had worked really hard to help create that Office of Police Oversight in the first place were upset, obviously. They felt like the Office of Police Oversight had really lost its teeth, that they had done all of this work and advocacy to change the police monitor to the Office of Police Oversight, and now a lot of those things had been taken away. And so they started to sit down together and say, okay, what can we do about this? Because again, the arbitration decision was not that OPO investigating some of these complaints violated state law, but that it violated the contract. And so they started to say, all right, well, we know we have a new contract that's coming up. We should, as activists, start to look at how can we influence that next contract to make sure that that won't happen again. And so they started doing advocacy around the contract, but at the same time, sort of had this idea of, well, what if this wasn't in the contract at all? Because they were getting tired of basically every 5 years when a new contract is negotiated, having to sit back down at the table with the Austin Police Association, it's like the union that represents our police department, and kind of renegotiate some of these oversight measures. They felt like we've already won them once, we don't want to have to fight for them every time again. That's, their perspective. And so they came up with and put together the language for this thing called the Austin Police Oversight Act, which is Prop A on your ballot. Basically, if you were to vote for Prop A, you're approving the creation of this ordinance, like a new law in the city, right? And the idea behind this ordinance was, what if, one, we give some of those powers back to the oversight office so that they don't lose them, and two, we kind of take this out of the contract negotiation process in a way to make it so that this is permanent and we don't have to worry about some of these things changing every few years. And so they gather the signatures here in the city of Austin. You have to gather 20,000 signatures, or 5% of our city's population, whichever is less, which is actually up for debate right now. City Council is thinking that that number might have to change. There's been a lot of ballot propositions lately. But anyway, so they gather those signatures over the summer here and get Prop A put on the ballot. And so it's set for it to be on the ballot in May. After they do that, in like November, December, another ballot proposition starts to circulate, also called the Austin Police Oversight Act. Canvassers are out in the community getting people to sign something they're also calling the Austin Police Oversight Act. At first, there's some confusion and debate in the community. Who is this group? Equity Action, who put Prop A on the ballot, is wondering, this is confusing because this looks a lot like our ordinance, but this isn't us. Eventually, through some support reporting and also just financial disclosures that you have to make with the city, comes out this second group is an organization called Voters for Oversight and Police Accountability. And it's basically entirely funded by the Austin Police Association. And so that is where, like, if you've been reading headlines or things like this, Equity Action accused this other group, again, acronyms called VOPA now, of kind of trying to trick voters by getting them to approve this secondary thing to be put on the ballot. That's the political debate. We won't get into the whole thing of it there, but that's like where the drama you're going to see is happening, right? So that was like a big moment. But anyway, that does end up getting put on the ballot, and that becomes Prop B. So now we have two police oversight measures on the ballot that, quite frankly, do very different things from each other. And if both are approved, they would approve something called the Austin Police Oversight Act. And so that's why if you look on your ballot, I can't remember the exact language, but it says on there, should we approve an ordinance submitted by Equity Action that would do XYZ? Or should, and then the other one, Prop B, says, should you approve an ordinance submitted by Voters for Police Oversight and Accountability that would do XYZ? You have the language on the handout. Okay, there it goes.
Just on the second page.
On the second
Go
page.
back.
Okay, yeah. So you can see there kind of that, why that language is in there, because otherwise, it's quite confusing. So that's why it says the organization that submitted it. That's not always the case in ballot propositions, but they kind of had to do that to make it clearer for the public. Okay, so I'll do a quick Prop A and B, and then I'll talk about kind of the impact it could have on our police contract. People might be aware we don't have a police contract right now. Okay, so Prop A, like I said, submitted by Equity Action. This is criminal justice reform advocates, organizations, kind of a broad coalition of a lot of the organizations you hear about that are involved in this work. Austin Justice Coalition, ACLU of Texas, Grassroots Leadership, those kind of organizations, right? Okay, so the main things it would do. One, it would give the Office of Police Oversight some of that investigatory power they lost during arbitration. And the idea, and the reason they've been advocating this, is because they feel like without the ability to look at body camera footage or dash cam footage, things like that from an incident, they are not able to really, the Office of Police Oversight is not really able to fundamentally understand if an infraction occurred. They want to be able to have access to all the information surrounding the incident to better understand, okay, what did happen here, and do we think it's a policy violation? That's kind of like this preliminary investigation. Then when they pass it along to Internal Affairs, which are the only people who are allowed to discipline police officers, are police officers. Like that's state law, that cannot change. So Office of Police Oversight can make all the recommendations they want. The police chief does not have to listen to them. But then when they pass it off to Internal Affairs, that they would be able to watch the investigation, but also recommend questions to the investigators, things like that. They're never able to speak to a police officer. I think they want a little bit more ability to watch those investigations take place, submit questions they want asked of those police officers. Again, that's kind of also still up to discretion if they get asked or not, but be able to submit them. And so that, and part of the reasoning for why Equity Action feels like this is important is because a lot of cases, when they're just passed along to Internal Affairs, never get investigated. There have been some audits, we've had some big police incidents that no discipline is ever issued for. And so the idea is we need a civilian oversight system that's able to have a little bit of a stronger role. So that's one big thing it would do. The other thing it would do is remove the G file. This is a topic of hot debate. The G file is like a secret file. It's basically that individual police officer's personnel file. And right now it's not open to the public. So basically the process is like, if a complaint is filed against you, an investigation takes place, it's looked through, and no official discipline is ever given, that's secret forever. It drops, everything from that investigation drops into this G file. That means a journalist cannot file a Freedom of Information Act request to get it. That's secret. Some criminal justice reform advocates feel like that is a perverse incentive for the police chief to never officially discipline officers, because then the public will never know. That's the argument, right, from that side. And so they want to get rid of the G-file. They also say sheriff's departments, other law enforcement agencies don't have a G-file. They operate just fine. We want more transparency, right? And then the other thing Prop A does is expand the statute of limitations when an officer can be disciplined. This has come up a lot in the news right now. There's a rule that says you have 180 days after an incident's been reported to discipline an officer. 181 days, that officer cannot be disciplined. So Prop A would extend that to 365 days, give more time for an investigation to take place. There's a lot more even that's in Prop A, but those are kind of these are some of the big things. The last little piece I'll say that's about Prop A is the Community Police Review Commission, which we haven't talked about yet. This is a citizen board or commission. So as opposed to Office of Police Oversight, which is paid professional City of Austin staff, Community Police Review Commission is one of the City of Austin's boards and commissions. Volunteers make it up, and they are allowed to review the most serious cases of officer misconduct, where death is involved or serious bodily injury. They're allowed to review that and make recommendations, kind of give their input as civilians as to potential discipline for that officer. Again, they get no decision-making power, but they're allowed to make a recommendation. Prop A would make some changes to that group. They would remove the felony bar. Right now, you're not allowed to serve on the Community Police Review Commission if you've ever in your whole life been convicted of a felony. They want to remove that. They feel like people who have had experience with the criminal justice system, especially if it was like 20 years ago, should still be eligible to serve on this commission. And there's also a clause in there that would allow members of that commission to more easily access confidential files. So that's like a lot of information. But I'll just switch to Prop B really quick.
Okay.
Prop B is really, you can just see it as directly in comparison to Prop A. The ordinance is very similar, but with key things omitted. So Prop B does not reinstate those investigatory powers that the OPO lost after arbitration. Prop B also eliminates Austinites' abilities to make anonymous complaints to the Office of Police Oversight. That's an ability we have right now, so that would remove that ability. It also, for the Community Police Review Commission, keeps that felony bar and actually adds an additional restriction, which is that you can't ever have been convicted of a Class A or B misdemeanor, which is a smaller crime than a felony. And so those are like, I would say, yeah, the primary big differences that you're seeing coming out of Prop B. So in just the easiest, quickest speak, right, Prop A is really increasing our Office of Police Oversight's powers and strengthening our civilian oversight system. Prop B, when compared to Prop A, is actually kind of pulling back some of our civilian oversight systems. There's also a whole legal questions, but I'm going to pause on that right now.
No, that's great. I think that's a wonderful background. So Carsten, having heard all this and kind of following up on Amy's description, because you've also had experience with this as other cities have dealt with it, could you just make some comments and bring that perspective into it?
Okay. So these were great presentations. I'm a little intimidated following up on them. I'm glad, though, that I'm going after you so I can sort of try to prop up my comments a little bit. So when I'm originally from Dallas, just in case anybody says, why are you talking about this Massachusetts man? I spent about 4 years in Massachusetts when my wife was in law school and I was working on my dissertation. And I participated in a study in Boston. And Boston had some of the same controversies at the time. One of the controversies, this is maybe a little bit more pronounced than was in Austin, is that, so there was probably about 6 police stations throughout Boston. And there were some police stations where if you had to file a complaint, if you wanted to go in and file a complaint, they wouldn't take the complaint, which is really shocking to me. I was startled by how abrupt or just how blatant that was. They would come out and say, we are not going to take that complaint. There were other situations. There was a sort of an unfortunate incident. It didn't have to sort of go this way, but there was an incident where some kids were playing in the street and a police car was speeding to the scene of a 911 call, and the police car almost hit the kids. And so the police car stopped, and they got out, and they're all, amped up from speeding to the scene of this 911 call. And the kids are all freaked out because they almost got hit by a car. And instead of just taking a breath, a physical altercation happened between the police and these teenagers. One of the teenagers wind up in the hospital. These were women, teenage women, and then one boy who had come outside, a young man, I think he was 11 or 12, he'd come out and seen his sister in this physical altercation. He became involved in the altercation. Long story short, they go to the hospital. At least one of the teenage girls wants to file a complaint, and the EMT says, I'm not taking that complaint. We don't do that. That could be bad for us. So one of the same woman, she eventually goes to the police department, and she's going to file the complaint. And this is really stunning to just sort of think about. I haven't thought about this in a while. We did this study in about 2005. But the police, they said, okay, we'll take your complaint, but your parents can't come with you, and we're taking you alone, and you're going to go into a room with internal affairs. And internal affairs, they were so intense and so over the top. They told her that if she got anything wrong, she could go to like juvenile hall, she could go to jail. And she came out and she was crying and she said, I'm not going to file a complaint. So you have sort of this chatter, this concern over the citizen complaint process. Boston, though, at the same time, you have these incidents happening. The police chief at the time, she's very proactive. You had many people in the police department that were upset about this. They had federal money. And so as part of that, one of the projects that they would do with the federal money is they decided we're going to do a sort of a nationwide examination of different areas and their different models of citizen participation in reviewing complaints. And I should have maybe started with this. Citizens participate in law enforcement in two ways, at least. One way that we're talking about now is citizens are part of reviewing how police handle complaints against the police. They sort of can play different roles. They can examine the process afterwards. They can examine certain cases, or they can be directly involved in actually taking the complaint and they do the entire investigation. The other way is less controversial. The other way that citizens participate in policing is neighborhood watch. So we have a neighborhood watch in our neighborhood. So they are involved in sort of policing. They have like a special little uniform, a little decal they put on their card. So they are involved in that. But anyway, Boston, as part of that project, we went to Arizona. We went to Colorado. We went to Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C., the Metropolitan Police, if you file a complaint against the police, you don't go to the police department. You go to a totally separate organization. That's its own organization, and it's very slick, and they actually have all of this amazing software, and they showed us how they store all the reports. But and then we did phone interviews with a couple of people. We looked at Cambridge, just across the Charles River, how they handle that. And so we did this big report where we just sort of reviewed, there's about 4 different kinds of models, and then we sort of reviewed through phone interviews or going there about 8 places. But then we studied all of the other ones, and we created this little database full of how other places do it. We can talk about the findings of that in a minute, but just maybe to wind up, this is controversial no matter where you are. So this is Texas. There's a lot of, Texas is a Republican state. Massachusetts is a Democrat state. So you think, you're a Democrat here, maybe you're thinking like, oh, this would never happen in a liberal state with Democrats. Well, we did this big report. I forget how much it actually cost in federal money. We were impressed with it. We thought we had done a good job. The police chief was happy with it. People in the police department, some people were happy with it. The police union, they wrote me a mean letter, but I didn't think that actually worked out. Sometimes the police union writes like I had just gotten my PhD. They were so mean to me, but I just took it. I mean, that's what happens. In Boston, they yell at you, but that's it. But everybody felt sorry for me at the police department, so they gave me more data than they probably would have. So they're like, we don't think they should have treated you like that. We're going to give you this data. But so we did this report. I'm so proud of it. And the mayor said, oh, thank you very much for doing that report. He takes that report and he said, by the way, I'm embargoing this report and I don't want to see it anywhere. You're not going to publish it anywhere. You're not going to take parts of it and put it out there. I think it was like within the last 5 years it was released. So, and that was a Democratic mayor, Democratic city, very liberal city. So it operated just sort of maybe where you'd see similar dynamics, but it was just a Democratic power structure. I will tell you, I tell my students, because my students are from all walks of life when I teach them, but that year I voted in a mayoral election. I voted for a Republican, so I'm like, I'm bipartisan. So I was mad about that and a few other things about the mayor. But anyway, so that's just sort of, people have questions, we can talk about it. But thank you for that, and thank you for those great introductions. So it was fantastic.
Well, that's great. I have a lot of questions, but I want to turn it over to you all to ask some questions because they probably duplicate mine. I will say, when I was in law school, I had a professor who talked about this situation where someone sort of questioned the integrity of your mom and her social mores or whatever, and said in Texas they just pull out a gun and shoot you. In Ohio, they'd say, put up your dukes, let's go to the mat. And in Massachusetts, they'd spit on the hands and say, you can't prove it. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Lori Andresen. One of the things that I've heard about before, and I'm still just puzzled with, is this special G file. How is it that was created, and how is it when nobody else has a secret file, when everything else is under the open records, as you said, the sheriff's office and any other county, state, city, federal is under open records? How is it that they were able to create something that was not subject to the open records?
Yeah, so basically the origin of the G file for Texas and Austin is basically because we're something called a Chapter 143 city. It's like a jargon term you might hear if you watch a lot of council meetings or some of these contract negotiations, which you do not have to be. I think like 20 years ago, we decided as a city we were going to become a Chapter 143 city. And that's just like a piece of state law. That's where that number comes from. And there's all these rules in it. And basically that's one of them, is that you have to have a G file unless under contract, your police department agrees not to have a G file. So like in Dallas never became a 143 city. They don't have a G file. Our sheriff's departments, they work for the county, so they don't have G files. So it's kind of like, I think it got started a little bit like a historical anomaly. At the time, cities were like, and this history is like, I'm a little hazier on, but from what has been relayed to me is like cities were jumping onto this Chapter 143 city idea. It was a while ago. One, we had a very different conversation about policing, but also part of it was to like enter into contracts with your police department and give them better pay and more stable, all these other things were wrapped into it. And that was a piece that now has become super controversial. So that's like kind of how it got there. And I'll say the Austin Police Association has been very clear. They absolutely do not want this to go. This has been like one of the biggest sticking points. The city has asked for it in several contract negotiations. And the Austin Police Association has said, this is something we will not accept. They feel like it violates police officers' rights of due process. They're worried too much information about police officers will become public. They can and kind of interfere with the police department's own internal investigation process.
Can I just ask a follow-up, which is?
Here, we're hold, because we need to.
You don't need to hold the microphone right up to your mouth.
Oh.
Hold it down here, that's fine.
Oh, okay. It just as a follow-up, can city council choose to not be a 143 city?
We would have to vote on that as a community, only by voter. So there was, am I talking about something?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Voters are the only ones. So that would have to be like another ballot initiative, basically, to get rid of us as a Chapter 143 city. There was, like 2 or 3 years ago, a group vaguely organizing around this idea of making us no longer a Chapter 143 city. They kind of dropped off on that plan. There are other parts. This part is like, again, there's a strategy here, I think, at play, but there are certain parts of being a Chapter 143 city that I think a lot of people agree with that might make it more difficult to vote out, which is a lot of the like pay and benefits for officers. There are other things in there besides the G file. That was kind of the strategy take that I've gotten from some activists. That might change as the years go on, but that's kind of, we would have to repeal it as voters.
Questions?
So I can imagine voters being really confused and voting yes on both. What happens if they both pass?
Yeah, so if they both, yeah, what happens if both pass? If they both pass, there's definitely going to be a lawsuit. I mean, I think that honestly, under many iterations of this thing, something is going to go to the courts. It seems likely that if Prop A passes and Prop B does not pass, that the Austin Police Association will probably try and take this to the courts. I don't know if that's true or not. They've kind of hinted at that. They seem to be really upset and feel like it violates state law. There's like a whole bunch of back and forth as to that. Basically, some of the idea here is there are certain parts, like I said, of Prop A, the G file, the 365-day extension, that can only be changed if the police agree to it in a police contract. Prop A says that City Council cannot approve a police contract without these things in it. So, Austin Police Association says Prop A is illegal. You can't get rid of the G file just by passing an ordinance. That's true. You can't get rid of it just by passing an ordinance. But what Prop A tries to do is basically force City Council's hand to be like, well, we will not pass a contract without this in it, and try and like force the Austin Police Association to agree to this, basically, as a negotiate, because now City Council can't approve something without it in it. There have been some council members who believe in police oversight, but are worried about this. They worry that this could just lead to a long legal battle or an impasse. Equity Action says, we think that's like a false choice and a red herring, and the Austin Police Association is just, doing negotiations. But we don't know, right? There is that world. So, but if both pass, they basically do the opposite thing. So that'll definitely go to the courts. And then there's a chance that if Prop A passes, APA might also take it to the courts. Also, at the same time, the legislature is considering some things that might override what voters decide. I would say regardless of all these legal issues, still important to vote. It's important to send a message, whatever way you are voting, that this is what the Austin public wants. And that's important. If both pass, like I've heard some people speculate that if both pass, a judge might kind of look at and see how many people voted in the Prop A election, how many people voted in Prop B, and might like try and take pieces or guess. So like your vote does matter. But if you're someone, it should be clear, you probably shouldn't vote for both. Like that doesn't, like maybe it doesn't, there's not a ton that would do. You're either someone who's like, I'm supporting Prop A, and you would vote yes, you want equity action and vote no on the other, or you would just vote for Prop B, or you might just not vote at all, or vote no on both. But voting yes on both, that doesn't really get you anywhere. I wouldn't think that's like a great idea necessarily.
Other questions?
During the process of collecting signatures, and Prop B came out after the equity action, it was very confusing. I even signed the darn thing. And then I tried to get my name off, which was, I don't know if it made it or not. How is that legal? It just seems so fraudulent to have had that sound so similar to Prop A. It was very misleading. And I've gone to all the police contracts meetings, and, I consider myself pretty knowledgeable about this. But so why wasn't that fraudulent?
I don't know if I can give you an exact answer on the last part, but I also met with several people when I was going to Starbucks and different things. And so the way the citizen-initiated ballot petitions are working and why the city is considering changing that in the fall is because groups will hire people. And this has kind of been an issue for 10 years. I used to live on South Congress, if you remember the Uber Lyft petitions, and I could not walk a step out of my apartment without getting swarmed, And so probably the way that was allowed is that the initial group submitting it, did have the redlined information. When I say redlined, it was the proposition, what the current rules are and what they were going to change on their website. But when they hired out folks to actually gather the signatures, they were really emphasizing police accountability, which of course is also on their proposition, without specifying exactly what that means. Because they are saying in their ballot that the Office of Police Oversight's role is to advise the city on investigations. It's just in the details they are taking away some of that teeth. So I think that's how they were able to get away with it. I know that when I was talking to a gentleman gathering signatures at Starbucks, he was giving me a line that you would think was very much Prop A, right? Like, we need to be able to have complaints filed, like we need more oversight. So, the league doesn't have a formal position on police oversight and how you should think about that, but we do very much consider transparency in voting. And it is so tough for voters when we have these very similar propositions. And in my opinion, it would be much better to just have folks vote yes or no on A. But I think because you can hire paid canvassers, that was part of the issue with that. You want to add anything? Yeah.
If it makes you feel any better, so I wouldn't say that I necessarily am like 100% Prop A, but I think things are so broken right now that I think, you should have more citizen involvement. There should be more, almost a forced connection between the police and the public to try to fix things. But I fell for it too. So that canvasser, I have this advice that I follow. A police officer told me during a ride-along, always ask the extra question. So I asked that person several questions, and I was very convinced that I was signing on to a Proposition A-like scenario. My daughter was with me, so it was like a civic lesson. Like, I believe there should be this change. And then, this is, so we're going to sign this, and while I may not agree with everything here, I believe in what they're doing. So I was completely fooled. And then after that happened, I talked with my daughter about it, and I said, it's time to watch like a 1930s gangster movie with, because that's what it sort of felt like. I felt like we were conned. It was like some sort of like 1930s, like ward politics, like, ha ha ha, let's create a fake petition and, get a bunch of signatures. So I would just say, even though the police union is not the police, most people's direct contact with their local government is through the police department. And, I have always been treated nicely by the police. I like the police. I like to research the police because I've had these meaningful contacts with them. And I have a good, view of the government because of my contacts with the police. So this very much kind of shook me. And it also, I feel ridiculous and stupid. Like I hope, when somebody disagrees with me, I'm like, if it makes you feel any better, I'm a fool. You can laugh at me. Like, yeah, let my ignorance be your joke, laughter. Yeah, thanks.
I'm going to go here because he hadn't had a chance for a question.
Thank you. Wayne Ewan, a member of St. David's Episcopal, as is Dorothy and maybe some others. And we want to get word back to them about, just how you look at this whole thing. I've got a couple of questions. One is a community publication. I think it's called Impact, I'm not sure. But anyway, they had an article. And in the last paragraph, this is my question, basically they said, if you do A, there's just a lot of problems. There's state issues, and so they put up a red flag. If you do B, it can go into force immediately. And that go into force immediately. I just was struck by that. And so my question is twofold. One, where do we get the word out in the community that is more transparent about what's happening? And this is part of that. Where else in the community will there be, or is there anticipated any other kind of community forum like this? And then the final question.
Let him answer those, and then we'll come back to that as a follow-up.
Yeah, so I guess, on the first question, which was about Prop B being able to go into effect immediately, I suppose that is true, but it doesn't really do anything different than what we have now. In fact, it actually takes away some of the oversight we have now. It's really hard to portray it any other way. Like, it literally, especially since this has been a little bit underreported, but we're not in a police contract right now. We fell out of that contract, which there's a whole bunch of good, legitimate debate around that, right? We do have issues as our city. Our police department is understaffed. There's been concerns about the police contract, right? That's kind of separate than what we're talking about here, but it's related. But anyway, we fell out of contract with our police department, which meant that our Office of Police Oversight regained those investigatory powers. So they kind of have them again now. That's a little bit under the radar, and I don't think they're trying to push that, but the arbitrator's decision said that the reason they lost that investigatory power was because of the police contract. Well, we're not in that police contract now. So technically, the Office of Police Oversight has those investigatory powers again. And they have the ability to accept those anonymous complaints. And our Community Police Review Commission doesn't have that Class A, Class B misdemeanor thing. So if Prop B passed, yes, it could go into effect now. And if that's what you want, and if you feel like that we shouldn't have that strong of a civilian oversight system, then Prop B could go into effect right now, and that would be it. But it does actually take away it would lessen what we currently have in place.
Does that answer? You had two questions. Does that answer?
Second, finishing the first.
Oh, yeah.
Do you have something to add?
Oh, I think it was about resources and how you can share the resources.
Additional community resources,
Right.
group meetings like this.
I don't know of any meetings in particular, but particular things you can share are Vote 411, the League of Women Voters of Austin area. Basically, what you're seeing on the back is what we have on Vote 411. It has everything that's going to be on your ballot. I know Amy produces a lot of social media infographics that are super easy to share if you have a community Facebook or something like that. Did you have another event you wanted to mention?
Oh, hold on. He's going to get an event, and I'm coming back to you.
Yes, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Central Texas Interfaith, but they're going to have one of their civic academies. I believe it's this Monday evening about that, and I believe we'll be able to Zoom to it. So if you get on the web and look for Central Texas, it's now, Central Texas Interfaith or Austin Interfaith. I don't know which one their website's doing now. But anyway, they have a civic academy, and it's kind of like this. They'll have a panel, and the people will be able to ask questions.
Thank you. Okay, follow up.
Thank you. Amy, you mentioned that something may be developing in the legislature. Would you elaborate?
Yeah, so basically, in its simplest form, it's like a preemption bill, which is common in the legislature with Austin, if you've been following Austin politics, which is they can see that we're about to do something and they pass a law to prevent us from doing it. It would basically prevent offices like the Office of Police Oversight from having some of this investigatory power. There's a few different bills that are circulating right now, but that is out there. It has not passed or anything like that, but it's in the ether, and you never know what the legislature might do. One criticism that's been levied against the Austin Police Association is that they have showed up to that legislature, and they have been really advocating, I think it's fair to say, pretty hard to get that passed. Yeah, and the Statesman just had an article, they were at one of those hearings, one of their reporters, and they asked the head of the Austin Police Association, what do you feel like is the role of police oversight? He said, none, if it weren't for contracts. So I think it's pretty clear where the Austin Police Association thinks here. And the kind of idea, in fairness, is like, the idea here, they feel like we already have an IA, we already have an internal investigations department in the police department, and we don't understand, and we don't feel like it's fair that someone who is from outside the police department, who doesn't understand what it's like to be a police officer, which is a difficult job, should be able to influence our discipline. That's the argument. But the Austin Police Association has made it pretty clear to the legislature they would prefer not to have any civilian oversight.
Yeah, hold on just a second. A couple of comments. I think we've all seen lobbyists, and we've all seen lobbyists say stupid things. And so, and I was a lobbyist at one point, and I know I said stupid things too. And so I'm a little bit concerned that might be a bit of an overstatement. And the reason I say that, and maybe I'm really naive, is I was at another event a while back, and there was a retired policeman talking about this. And his position was, well, let me just mention two things. One on the G files. Mm-hmm. He said a lot of stuff goes in those G files. A lot of personal stuff. In his case, he went through a divorce, and it had all the information about the divorce. There's also, as you mentioned, complaints that have been filed but not been accepted. So if there have been a number of complaints that have been filed and none of them really panned out, but a G file is opened up and it has all that, it creates an impression that's an improper impression. So I don't know whether that's 100% true, but it rang true to me a little bit. And so one of the things that we have a workshop at Braver Angels, and we ask a group of people leaning on one side of an issue to go into a fishbowl. And we're going to do the same thing to the people on the other side of the issue. And we ask them, why is your position on this issue the right one, good for the community, good for the country? And they talk about their values around that and why the specific policies support those values or enhance those values, promote those values. And then we ask them a question, what are your reservations or concerns about your position on this issue? And so what I would like to open up a little bit, especially as experts, what are your concerns about Prop A? Because so far the discussion kind of is going in one direction, and I'd just like to introduce a little bit of balance in that. And it's open to anyone. It doesn't mean you're saying anything about how you're voting or whatever, okay? But just, okay, thanks.
confession, I live one block outside of the city of Austin, so I actually can't vote on it. So in my day job, I do work with law enforcement officers. And one thing I'll say about unions is their role is to be for their employees, not for the greater good, right? The 8 Austin Police Department's role is for the greater good, right? But the union is there to advocate for their members only, right? And so something Amy was talking about too, sometimes if they say, we won't do this, it could be a negotiation tactic. Maybe they really want higher wages. But if you take all the pieces off the negotiation table, the city's not just automatically going to give you higher raises, right? So I think it is, you have to think one thing. When the union says one thing, that's not necessarily what the police department believes, okay? And so you want to separate that. Also, law enforcement's a very difficult job. It's underpaid for the difficulty that it requires. I can tell you there's an enormous amount of training requirements. So many that you need extra officers to cover because officers have so many training requirements. You have to deal with the public at their worst moment. You have to deal with a lot of things that probably shouldn't fall to law enforcement, but because of our lack of a social safety net, do fall to law enforcement. And so I think they generally have some concerns. For me, in my job where I'm at my computer, I'm not filmed. I don't have anybody checking on me, and my job's pretty easy, right? But if you're having required oversight, like through body cams, for example, on every moment when you're dealing in high stress situations, you can imagine that that's difficult. So I think what we were all getting at is, like Amy was saying here a second ago, is that citizens being able to allow oversight that have never been law enforcement officers. There's some concern that they don't understand the stress of the job. They don't understand the proper ways they're required to do things based on their training. I'm definitely not advocating against transparency, but I would think that might be their argument if they were here.
And isn't that one of the provisions in that is that anyone who has any connection with a police department cannot be a member of this board, this review board?
That's correct, yes.
Okay.
And so the other thing I was thinking of is even anonymous complaints. The one thing Prop B would take away that we currently have, oftentimes those anonymous complaints are done internally, but you can kind of consider both sides, right? Like you would want that as an option if you were worried about being a whistleblower, but it could also be that you really hate your boss and you want to submit an anonymous complaint. I'm not saying that is a worthwhile thing to take away, but I'm sure that's the argument of thinking there just could be a wave of anonymous complaints because of that. You want to add?
Yeah, I'll just add that is one of the concerns that's been raised about anonymous complaints, is that officers internally will use it basically against coworkers they don't like in order to prevent them from getting a promotion or whatever if they're both up for the same thing. That's a concern. Do you want to chime in on that specifically?
Nothing.
And I'll just say, and I'm curious to see, since you've done research in other places, I think the real crux of, there's like all this political stuff. The real crux of like the deeper conversation is like, how do we want to do oversight of our police? We know that there are issues, right? Like there's been these high profile cases. We've had terrible situations happen here in Austin and throughout the country. We know we need something to make sure that officers cannot do some of these terrible things we've read about in the news, right? But how do we do it? And that's like really at the more core of the argument, where the one side is like, hey, we need eyes that are not connected police on this because we already have police eyes on it from internal investigation. We need a civilian side. Whereas again, officers that are already working double shifts because they're understaffed, have raised concerns that they feel individually, that the director of the Office of Police Oversight is attacking them personally, and making their job a lot harder, and that they feel like they can't do their job because someone might complain about them at any moment, and then they'll have that hanging over their heads as a very public investigation is held out. So that has been a lot of the kind of counter argument. And I'll just say the legal piece is also a big part of the conversation, which is just this fear that we'll basically never have a police contract again. That is what some have argued, that I would say are more on the pro-civilian oversight side, but worry that politically what will happen is the police association will never agree to this contract, city council won't be able to accept a contract without the terms, and it'll just kind of lead to like chaos at the police department, where officers will quit or retire, and our numbers were drained down lower. That's kind of like the spiral situation that we have no idea, but that is like another concern. Councilmember Allison Alter has raised that. She's worried that basically we'll just get in a huge fight that'll be drawn out with our police department, and we already have this issue, and it could make it worse.
So it would make recruiting.
Difficult if we can't ever come back into a contract with each other because they refuse to agree.
Yep.
That's it. Yeah.
Oh, and I was just going to say one thing that they suggested in Boston that I haven't heard talk about here, and I think it would be really effective, and it would address, it's what's I think a big missing piece is we suggested in Boston that there would be mediation, that there might be the option for citizens and the police to actually just sort of sit down and be able to talk. And I mean, without going into a lot of detail, I think a lot of the controversies and unpleasantness that happened during the summer of 2020, maybe we could be going through some of that stuff if there was some sort of mediation. I don't know what would happen afterwards, what you'd have to do to protect people. But the idea is that if a police officer has an exchange with you that's unpleasant, that you could sit down and you could talk to one another, and they could get a chance to maybe apologize or to rethink that. I mean, you're going to be defensive if somebody files a complaint against you. But if you actually were like, I was really short with that person, I was rude, and just to say, you know what, I'm sorry, I need to do better. I didn't mean to do that. I'm not making an excuse, but I'd had a bad day. Would you please accept my apology? That person, if they do accept their apology and then they apologize, I mean, it could be really positive. So, but I would just say, I would echo what they said before. With those body cameras, everybody's watching you all the time. I have a friend that's a lawyer who incidentally, he used to work for a famous politician in the Northeast. I better not mention that person's name, but I said to him one time, I'm worried about controversial topics in the classroom. Maybe I'll record all my lectures. He said, oh no, never record yourself. All it takes is a lawyer going through that, and they'll find 5 minutes from 300 hours, and you'll never work again. So, you know, police they record all their contacts, so all you have to do, in New Jersey, you could get a complaint if you weren't wearing your hat. So, you know, you film yourself enough times, you're not wearing your hat because it's a windy day, okay, you've just got an internal complaint. So I would just...
Thank you. That was very helpful. Some more questions here, and then back to you, Mark.
If someone wanted to see the actual petitions for Proposition A and Proposition B, how would they go about seeing the actual petitions now?
Yeah, it's on the city clerk's website. Yeah, so if you kind of just Google City of Austin clerk, there's a little elections tab that you can read the full text of each of these oversight things, and you can also look up the funders for all the organizations or any organization in Austin that does kind of political work. So it's always a good one to look at.
And some folks have put together sort of red line version, of the Prop B versus Prop A.
Equity Action does have it's from Equity Action, but they have a red line version. So of their original Prop A, and then it's either redlined or crossed out where changes have been made. That is helpful to look at the differences between the two. Yeah, I think they just published that same one. Yeah, but I mean, it's the same. It's been looked at by many people. Like, that's accurate cross outline. No one's really objecting to that. It's literally like the document.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Could somebody elaborate a bit on how Prop A constitutes the oversight board? Is that an elected position? Who appoints them? And if Carsten, you could comment on how what's being proposed fits in the constellation of best practices that you've observed?
Right, for the office.
Well,
I'm double checking.
And the auditor's office.
Okay.
too, actually.
So one thing about how the city's structured, as you might know, we have a city manager, an interim at the moment, right? And so council doesn't usually directly manage all the city departments. So there's the city manager and most of the city departments underneath them. However, there is a separate department. The city auditor doesn't fall under the city manager. It reports directly to the council. It's kept separate so that it can audit everything the city manager is doing. And the Office of Police Oversight Director, I believe, is hired in conjunction with both of them.
That one I'm not sure about. I was thinking more the Community Police Review Commission.
Okay,
Their applications, I think, go through the auditor.
okay. It could be, I actually think that makes more sense. The city manager, I believe, hires the Office of Police Oversight. And then the Police Review Commission comes from the city auditor. So it's kind of separate groups. And then the Office of Police Oversight Director would hire their staff underneath them. Does that make sense?
I'm sorry, so does the city
Oh,
council
hold on.
No,
pick that person? Who hires that person? Yeah. Who hires that person who heads that department?
so it's not the city council, it's the city manager that would hire it. The city council hires the manager or as part of the process. So, yeah. Did you want to add the second one?
And then what was the other part of the question?
The constellation
yeah,
of
that was-
best practices.
I did a little preparation for this. What we said in Boston, and I agree with this, it depends on what the needs of the local community are. So in Washington, D.C., so there's sort of four kinds. I've just got these new glasses today. I'm sort of getting used to them. But there's a full external, and I think that's kind of what they're suggesting here. It's outside of the police department. It operates on its own. It can conduct the investigations. It has subpoena power. That's, I think, what they're suggesting here. That's what they have in Washington, D.C. And when we talked to the police then, when we talked to that office, they totally like that. The police were like, we don't have to deal with this. We like it. And I'm sure that there's some sort of relationship where they like each other. That model, though, can be very complicated. It is easy to go from sort of a revolutionary pressing for change to suddenly you have to run a big office where you have a lot of responsibilities and then you have to answer to the constituents that voted for you. But there's full external, there's internal with external review, and then there's like a monitor, an ombudsman, or an auditor, and that's a single person that goes in and they can kind of review certain complaints, and it's a certain individual, and then there's a hybrid model. Just to say sort of what I think the best practice is figuring out what's going to work within that community, and it may be that what a community prefers, and I did not mean to like endorse what I was going to vote for, I was just telling you about my experiences, but it may be that a certain model of citizen review is, favored for a time, and then it changes. So some of these citizen review organizations, they change over time. So, but I would think whatever you are going to do, you should have clarity, you should be communicating about it, you should talk about the pros and cons. In Boston, the model that they selected was something that I think would have worked out well, and some of the things that, even though the report was embargoed, some of those changes sort of came into fruition today, just in the way that the police department is running their operations. It was nice at Northeastern. We were 2 blocks away from the police department, so we could just walk over there. But yeah.
Amy.
A slight caveat to that. Yeah, I think I would classify what Prop A is trying to do is a little bit more of a hybrid. But and like I think this does get kind of confusing to your point about clarity or all parties being on board with what the thing is, because still at the end of the day, and I'd be curious, I am not an expert in like this part of state law, but my understanding is, it still is just the police chief that's allowed to discipline officers. And so really what's happening here is like OPO, the Office of Police Oversight, is doing an investigation, and also the Internal Affairs Division is doing an investigation, because at the end of the day, the Office of Police Oversight doesn't have the ability to do anything more than make a recommendation. Maybe they can make it public if if Prop A passes, so there could be more publicity around it, but they still can't issue any discipline like maybe you would expect in full external. I'm not sure what that model is. They don't?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
just
They
have-
still pass it along.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. So it like I think under this model, the idea is like basically kind of two investigations are happening, or there's like another eye watching an investigation after a preliminary investigation has been done. It's a little confusing, but
My understanding is that both propositions on the form itself had the exact same title. Isn't that correct? That's what I don't understand why that's legal. It's not, whether someone misrepresented, what was in it, but why is that legal to have the exact same title when you are intentionally having something that says something different than the other one?
I don't know that I'm going to give you the answer you love, which is why is it legal? I don't know. But I do know that the city is going to review its policies for citizen-initiated ballots in the fall. And they're going to consider several things: how many signatures are required, if you can pay canvassers, and maybe when they open it up to public comment, that would be a great thing. And their attorneys can determine if they could include that in future citizen-initiated ballots, which I think you're correct, would have solved a lot of the confusion on Prop A and B. Yeah.
We're at 7:30, which is the time we said that we would finish up. I'm sure, I'm going to say this, that our panelists would be happy to stay around a little bit and just chat with you. There's still some refreshments, and please take advantage of that and just meet one another. But
And help us thank them.
yes, and yeah, it was great. Really, thank you. And thank Joanne for hurting everything to make this happen. That was wonderful. All right, we are done, and please enjoy the refreshments.
I don't want to